Welcome everybody.
Would you like read out this?
Yeah.
All right. So I want to talk about intention sync. Basically, there's a bunch of extraordinarily weird phenomena that pertain to two people interacting, and then it looks like maybe an explanation of what's going on there then allows us to bridge to a more general theory of what's happening with groups. And I will flag that I guess I would say that different parts of this overall picture I consider to be solid to different degrees, but I think a bunch of it is solid, and a bunch of it is like very suggestive and so forth, and so I suspect that this is something that we're going to end up sort of like looking at a lot. Anyways, that's the general setup. Let me just say some initial things. As usual, feel free to interrupt me as we go. We started talking about intentions quite a lot. Intention, it's a sort of strange term for us to be using because we're inside the CT paradigm, but CT doesn't use that term, and there is no naturalization of that term currently. So what are people talking about when they say intention? So for now, no definition. There is in CT the idea that people act in accordance with what they believe will happen, is the action rule. So you can, if a person has a projected future and they think things will follow this course and result in them getting their basic goals, then this is the sort of what they believe will happen, and then CT says that they'll act in accordance with that. Yeah.
I don't know if you're going to cover this or not, but can you cover how macro scale beliefs about what's going to happen end up in actual action?
Yeah. So, excellent. So the question is about macro scale beliefs. So there's a question as to if you're acting in accordance with what you believe will happen, then you're probably not right now acting in accordance with this part of the thing. So it seems much more like something like you're going to act in accordance with what you believe will happen immediately, like this part right here.
Right.
Or maybe like just this part, like the tiniest sort of initial sliver. And so you could imagine that what will happen is, so long as the person's belief about the time series stays the same, and all that changes is their belief as to where they are in the time series, then the person will act in accordance with this, then this, then this, then this, and so on through the entire thing. Of course, it may be that factors in the world change or occur in an unexpected way, which cause the person to change their expectation as to how things will happen, which will then, when they believe that they're at the relevant spot, cause them to act in a different way. So probably the action rule should be amended to talk about people acting in accordance with what they believe will happen next, or something like that. But we can make this distinction between what people believe will happen immediately and what will happen eventually. There's also, like the CT states this in a sort of surprisingly passive way. It's, people act in accordance with what they believe will happen, not they'll act in accordance with what they believe they will do. Right, so you can make a distinction between what a person believes they will do and what a person believes will happen to happen. And so if a person believes that, the leaf will fall from the tree and land on the ground and that this will occur immediately, do then they act in accordance with the leaf detaching from the tree and then act in accordance with the leaf falling? It seems like people are acting in accordance with what they believe they'll do, but if you formulate it like that, you've included the self-concept, and then it's like unclear what I is supposed to refer to, and is it really the case that action's always pegged to a self-concept in that way? Not sure. Yeah?
You would peg it to like the direct body feelings rather than the self-concept.
I suspect, right? I think something like that. So it might be that it's the beliefs that are touching the actuators. And so you act in accordance with whatever you believe will happen immediately, where those are the beliefs that are the ones that are referring directly to the actuators, meaning like, moving your body, or people can modify their autonomic nervous system, or etc. So, yeah.
in the case of the leaf, one would also be producing imaginations
Well,
consistent with the expectation of the leaf.
yeah. So that's a really interesting
So-
question, right? So it could be that you are acting in accordance with everything you think will happen. In that anytime you expect a thing to happen, you produce imaginations that then fill in the relevant thing. And so it could be that it could be that the entire thing is active. So I think there's a number of questions here which aren't resolved. And because these things aren't resolved, the term intention is supposed to refer to this area. And so when people say, what do I mean by intention, I say, well, basically you want to look at what people believe will happen immediately and what they believe they will do, so the active component of that. But perhaps also what they believe will happen eventually, and perhaps what they believe will happen eventually will leave some sort of imprint or something, or so will leave some sort of sign on what they'll do, on what they believe will happen right away. And also the look for the intention at what they believe they'll do, but also look at the things that they also think will happen, because maybe those just are part of the intention, or maybe they leave an imprint on the intention in such a way that that's the right thing to look at. So if you think of this stream here as composed of an active component and a passive component, then when I refer to intention, I mean the active and nearby component, but also look at the passive nearby component, and also sort of look at the whole thing. We don't have this worked out precisely. Yes?
Can you talk about the conceptual distinction between this vague thing you're calling intention and the believed plan?
Yeah, so if this thing is so when people use the word plan, so the questions about I frequently repeat the questions for the camera, so the questions about this is versus believed plans. Frequently believed plan refers to something the person endorses. If you look at the actually anticipated sequence of things that will lead to the person achieving their basic goals, then that's this thing, and then the intention, maybe the correct thing is just to say the intention is the believed plan, but maybe the intention is just the immediate part, or maybe it's just the immediate active part, or maybe it's the immediate active part noting that frequently receives some sort of impression or imprint from the immediate passive part and the longer term parts. And that's about as clear as I can get on that particular thing. It is also the case.
Intention is possibly the same thing as the believed plan, but possibly also just like a different way of looking at some of that content.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, cool. So that's what I mean by intention. And then basically intention has come to appear to be more and more important the more we study people. So initially you just have, well, obviously intention matters because intention determines the actions. And so, or intention is part of the actions in some way. So so it's important for that reason. In May of last year, we added the intention claim. So there's the intention postulate, which says that people update where they pay attention, and the intention claim, which says that their intention is part of their attention. This means that if you think about it like, here's the person's mind, they've got all of this content connected in various ways, and then the attention is like a spotlight that moves around over the content, and wherever the spotlight is, then updating is occurring. In CT, updating is always in the direction of local elegance, which means things are being fit together. And so you can think about this like a spotlight moving through the mind where the different parts are being fit together. Well, being fit together with what? Well, you can purposefully load content into your lens, so to speak, and so this will sort of drag it around with your attention. Like I like to give people the proposal that they walk around the lake looking at people with the idea in their lens that everyone's a spy, or that everyone is actually secretly a billionaire. And things will like look different. You'll just like notice different things and see different things. That's carrying around material along with your attention. It is also the case that when you perform mental moves to yield belief updating, what you're doing is you're composing, so like you're like, I have a new plan which I will replace my old plan with. What you're doing is you're taking the material in the new plan and then putting that into your attention and bringing that over to the relevant area so that you have your the new content. Like let's say you've got some dysfunctional part of your mind here, which has got a bunch of negative content, where content will symbolize thus. And you've got your new content. Well, what you do is you then pay attention to the new content and bring it over here so that your attention is now on both. This yields propagation, and ideally the new content is set up in such a way that it wins and it flips the old content. So this is the general mechanism behind intentional belief change. The fact, though, is that even if you're, or at least the intention claim is that even if you're not sort of purposefully trying to do that, you still have some intention, and that's always there in your lens, so that as you build a model, it will then be formatted so as to be receiving material from your intention. Another way of saying this is that you build a model of how the things that you experience fit in with your intention, which means, I like to use the example of games. If you expect to win, you build a model of how you'll win. If you expect to lose, you build a model of how you'll lose. Okay, cool. Well, that means intentions are very, very important. They determine action and also model shape. Yeah.
I feel like we need more coverage of that, but maybe you'll just skip over. But so there's a couple different claims here. One is that the attention, attention, is has variable shape in that, like, you can have maybe two spotlights that go around, like you're paying attention to two areas simultaneously.
So it's an interesting question. There's been a lot of controversy over secondary attention and whether that's a thing. At least I'll claim that you can have two contents in your intention in your attention at the same time.
Right, which.
So what's happening is you have a
maybe there isn't secondary, but it's like yeah, you can load, like, it's not just that you have to pay attention to the local beliefs. You can have the attention paying attention to this belief and that.
That's right.
Okay, the distinction between that thing, that somehow interacts with the intention, which.
So the claim is
I'm
just
not sure
the claim is just that the intention is loaded in to the attention, so that some of the material that's always being brought around is your intention. So if the person has an intent, if the person has the expectation that things will go very well for them, or if they have the expectation that things will go well and then collapse, where finally they'll be brought to justice, then that's always there, and their models are being formed in response to that.
So in the like intention, or sorry, there's so many words that are so similar. In the intention is belief plan model, what we're saying is that the attention always includes one eye on, like, the flavor of the believed plan, such that, like, the updating is always happening somewhat with respect to your believed plan.
Yeah, that's right. And so a way of thinking about this is that the mind is always producing a functional model. It's always trying to produce a model that is tuned towards the achievement of particular effects.
Right, that makes sense.
Okay, so that's some background on intention. It has then recently looked like, in addition to determining action and model shape, intention also seems to be important in a further way, which I'm now going to start to describe. Now, different people will have interacted with this to different degrees, and so some people will be like, yes, I've heard this. Others will be like, yeah, that's crazy. And then some will be like, what? So we, just noting that there's going to be sort of people coming to this from different angles. So I want to talk about body work, energy healing, and a further thing which one might call joint introspection. Not a really good name for it, but it's super weird. Let me start off with body work. Recently, there was to be a graph of total amount of body work occurring inside our group. It would be like this, and it's like sort of going up. Okay, why is that? What is body work, etc.? The body worker comes in, and frequently, it's going to be very simple. They just put their hands on the person. It's like, okay. Then, interestingly, the person starts to experience psychological effects. Okay, why is this? Perhaps it is the healing power of touch with the calming and soothing influence of another human there. Yeah, maybe, but notably the body worker can intentionally change the effects. And you can get a wide range of effects, and the effects really just don't look like it's the soothing presence of a person. It's like, it just doesn't feel like what's happening there. And notably, this isn't just like external body workers, like people like Dima or Emily's mom who visited us. A bunch of us can do this also. So this is a thing where you can have, where some of us know how to put hands on a person such that then the person then starts experiencing a bunch of psychological updates. How do we know they're psychological updates? We have introspection, you can do belief reports, you can check. Sometimes the stuff is hard to identify. In other cases, you can check before and after and see it looks like, wow, look, looks like I was believing X and now I'm not. The only thing that happened in between was the body work, and also you get the standard attendant effects of psychological change, like the person cries and twitches and so forth in the same way as they cry and twitch when you're doing regular sort of like verbal psychological work. Okay, so how does that work? Well, go ahead.
Just for legibility, could we get a show of hands of who has done body work and gotten updates like this?
So received or given?
Maybe two.
All right, so
each.
Received. Given. All right, cool. We win. Thanks, James. That was good. So how does this work? It is like a sort of weird effect. Like if you were thinking, like, how do the humans cause psychological change in one another? You wouldn't expect that the answer is going like this and then waiting for a while. That seems like boring and not technically skilled and it just seems very weird. Well, luckily we understand the mechanism behind intentional belief change really well. The mechanism involves, like I described, simultaneously paying attention to two things. You've got the pre-existing mind, which has some content that you'd like to change, and then there's some positive content. Maybe the positive content is located here. In some cases, you'll have another person. So you've got the trainer, and the trainer has the relevant positive content. In this case, it needs to be communicated to the person, and then you take the positive content in their mind and bring this over here by paying attention to both at the same time. That causes propagation, and if you did it properly, then the positive side wins. Sometimes the negative side wins, in which case back out, go get better content, and come back and win using the better content. Okay, that's the general mechanism. And then the theory behind body work is that the body worker is doing two things. First, they are, or they can be doing two things. They can also just do one of these. Any one of them in combination with the person being set up to do the other will produce the effect. But there's the conveying of material and directing the person's attention. And what you need to have is that these things can be done by touch. It so happens that what the body workers do is they set their intention in a particular way, and also will sometimes be intending to direct the person's attention inside their body to different areas. Now, areas of the body, as we have learned, have psychological content associated with them. How exactly does that work? We're not sure, but it does look like people add muscle tension to their body in order to redirect their attention. And so at least you get attentional redirects based on areas of tension. It also seems not unlikely to me that you get people developing a very rich model of their own body, like sort of the body map, and then attaching other things to this sort of like very large sort of model in their mind. So instead of thinking about it like you just learn each of the models in a disconnected way, it may be that you use the previous models to understand the new things. And you're learning your body really early on, and so then you use that to understand other things. I'll say, again, I don't think we exactly understand why, but we do find that there's psychological content attached to different parts of the body, which means that all you have to do is direct the person's attention to different parts of their body and have them have loaded up the right sort of content. And if you do that, then you can cause psychological change. Now, there's like basic and advanced versions of this. Like a very basic version is just that you have a very, very neutral intention with regard to the person. And you put your hands on them, and then you just wait. And you pay attention to, maybe you put your hands on two parts of the person, and you pay attention to both, with the intention to allow material to move back and forth between them. Something like that can be enough to produce substantial psychological effects, both as measured by the crying, shaking, etc., and checking belief reports before and after. Yeah.
By psychological, do you mean something more specific than a change in representational content?
No.
Because it's plausible that if a person touches another, they can get a better understanding of connection being possible, but coming to have metaphysical knowledge by being touched by another, it seems less plausible.
Well, okay, so there's a question as to how specific this gets. And it's actually quite interesting, where you could imagine that the only thing that you could do with this is direct the person's attention to some part of their body. Now that actually could be super useful. When we met Dima, which is one of the sources from which we originally encountered some of this material, he talked about being able to, just with a contact point, cause people to be able to walk again, or at least that he has done this in at least one occasion. Now, interestingly, if somebody isn't walking because so we frequently find that people have muscles that aren't engaged, and they have no plan to engage them. And it's like quite tricky to get them to get their attention to the muscle in such a way that they re-engage the muscle. You could have a person who is not walking because, as it turns out, they just don't have a plan to move the relevant muscles, and they also don't move their attention there. If that's the only problem, then if you can redirect their attention and hold it there, then they may propagate material, update, and now have a plan to actually use the relevant muscles. This would restore the person's ability to walk. Yeah.
How often is that the case?
That it's only that? I'm not sure. My sense is that frequently when people have injuries, there comes to be momentum, psychological momentum behind them. So the person might injure something and then immobilize that and then choose not to move it and then sort of route around. So like in a simple case, the person changes their gait a little bit to account. They sprained an ankle, so they're avoiding putting weight on the thing, and then they end up with a sort of descendant of the plan to not put weight on the thing. That's not going to do so much as cause them to not be able to walk, but might alter their gait. You could imagine that a person has a more severe injury where they actually can't walk, and then they drop the plan to use the muscles in the relevant way, and then they heal. I'm not really sure on total percentage. I'm willing to say that I suspect this is happening in a non-zero number of cases. Yeah.
Yeah, there's also just huge benefits to being hurt as well. Like, people take care of you, you don't have to do things.
Yes, you get those.
You
You can.
stack the
That's right. So it could be that they just drop it from their plans because it wasn't useful, but then they find that it's really useful to no longer have to do the things. And people do have all sorts of things in their mind about ways in which they sabotage themselves or expect things to not work. And so maybe the person was expecting that they would be injured in a way which would cause them to no longer be able to do things, and then others would have to take care of them. And then they entrench on that plan, and now they're no longer using the relevant muscles. It would be super interesting to know the rate at which certain types of immobility were caused by, were just psychological in that they could be changed by this method. I'm not sure. Yeah.
Could you speak to how deliberately a person can cause specific updates,
right.
and also
Yeah,
how
yeah.
abstract the updates can be?
Yeah, so this starts to get weird because what this does is this unlike before when it was extremely normal. You end up with this sort of being a new area that we're investigating. So we're like, okay, you can cause propagation between two areas in the person's body. Can you do other things? And then, because we can introspect doing this, of course, introspection's imperfect, etc. But I think we do have sort of notable ability there, and also can calibrate on how good the different people are at introspecting. You then start getting stories like, well, person A touches person B, and feels like there's some sort of problem there, which they then bring into their own body. This is what's reported. And solve the problem there, and then put the material back into the person, causing the problem to be solved there. So we have, I think, multiple reports of that occurring. And then you're like, well, but okay, how on earth could that possibly work, right? There's a question as to like what the sort of bandwidth is in this thing. So if all that's happening is you're directing the person's attention by like putting pressure on parts of the person's body, then you wouldn't be able to do that. But I mentioned that that's like the simple version of the thing. There's a much more complex, like sort of more nuanced version where you put your hand on the person and then you move your hand around in subtle ways so as to pick up, and so there's a question as to what's happening, but you frequently get it to be that the person who has the intention to affect the other person moves their hand around in subtle ways that then from the inside feels like you're locking on to what they're doing inside their body. It's like if you apply a very small amount of pressure and you feel them move their muscles like very slightly, this can give you a read on where their attention is going. And so there's a question as to how high bandwidth of a lock can you actually get. We were sort of I was initially astonished by Dima's claim that he could track people's attention just by having a hand on somebody. I now believe that is possible. Dima demonstrated this and was able to call out what Mia was doing with her attention while she was doing it. It also, just from doing this myself, you can, it's like feels very weird as you step into it because you're like, where are my epistemics? Like, how do we know any of this works? I feel like your attention is going in a loop, starting at your head, going down the front and then up the back, but not completing the loop. And the person's like, yes. And you're like, what? But perhaps groupthink or let me try again. And like you sit there and keep guessing, and you end up with a high enough hit rate inside of a field that looks like it's sort of. It's not like there's only two answers, yes or no. And you're like yes, and they're like yes, and you're like no, and they're like it's like. It seems like there was a lot of focus on your right hip, and they're like, yep. And you're like, okay, but I was trying to get the attention over to your, left torso, and I couldn't do it. And they're like, yep, nope, didn't get over there. And so there still are errors. I have a model of how and where the errors occur, but it looks like you end up with at least somewhat high bandwidth interaction with the person. And then there's a question of how high bandwidth does this actually go, and like what's actually being communicated. This whole thing yields my model of sexual chemistry, where the way to think about this is that people are sort of like saying a sentence by default with their bodies. And if they touch and the sentences link up in the right way, then you get sexual chemistry. There's a question as to like what is the actual, what are the words in the language? Maybe the vocabulary is just like yes, no, wait, okay, and follow. Where then if, one person is like by default saying like, yes, no, wait, follow, and the other person's going follow, wait, no, and something like that, then the thing links up and you get various sorts of effects where I think sexual chemistry is one of them. I think there'll be other ones. That's a brief thing on body work and how that works. Next, I want to talk about energy healing. So let's like crank up the weirdness by a notch. This is actually a really fun presentation because we're going to get so weird and we're going to start talking about sacrificial kings and stuff like that. Though we have to start off with simpler things like body work. Okay, so adding one level to the sort of total shocking weirdness of this. So energy healing. Energy healing, so whereas the body worker comes and lays their hands on you and then you experience psychological effects, the energy healer does that at a distance. So the energy healer from across the room goes like, and then the person starts to twitch, and then they cry, and you get the sort of standard things that come along with it. I will explain shortly how the force choke could be accomplished in regular life.
Complete
Overheard.
What? Yeah.
complete with levitation or no?
Levitation, we do not yet have a model as to how that could be accomplished.
Why are we?
No, and it's a really interesting thing because with energy healing, it's notable because you get the same effects. You get the crying and shaking. You also get the twitching and whatnot, the sort of standard things that attend certain types of psychological change. It's also the case that you can check belief reports before and after and see that things have actually changed. Changes in emotions, etc. Yeah.
Has anyone, if you're working on energy healing, thought of attending a Pentecostal service on the weekend?
Certainly been mentioned.
Certainly.
They do a lot of this stuff, right?
Yeah.
So they'll do like laying on of hands, and then people will start fucking like twitching and falling and like all sorts of crazy stuff.
So I think this is the mechanism behind that. I think we should check it out to see if the more advanced, there probably are more advanced people there who have cool things we could learn on a practical level. But then it looks like you have the same thing happening as body work, except that you're not touching the person's body. So how does that work? Well, there's a mechanism. Luckily, I think we do understand the mechanism of intentional belief change quite well. And so we know that the thing needs to be conveying material, and we know that it needs to be directing the person's attention. And then there's a question of whether this can be done without touch and without words. So words do it, touch does it. Can you do it in some other way? Well, I think it works if you postulate that people have very detailed responsive models of each other's intentions as revealed through body movement, facial expression, and so on. So my current model of this, which I am not sure is correct, but is the thing that I postulate to explain. And I should note that with energy healing, yes, some of us can also do this. So it is possible we should do a show of hands. How many people have had effects caused in you remotely or by somebody doing the sort of energy healing movements, but while not touching you? Okay, and then how many have caused effects in other people while not touching the person? Yeah, okay, cool. So about half as many, but it's a bunch. So yeah, so it's real. So if you imagine that the person ends up conscious and updating in a normal manner while they're still in the womb, the person might get a sort of an initial model of their phenomenology or the inside of their mind. They're born and now able to perceive external objects. And if you postulate that at this point they get a model of how bodies move, not how their body moves, but how all bodies move, such that they can later they're part of that, but they can later section that part off. But beforehand, they haven't made a distinction as to which one they are. And frequently the things are happening in concert. They make a movement and their mother smiles, and so on. So long as the person is learning all the bodies together, and then so long as you have something like each model is used as the sort of material through which the later things are understood. So I think later you'll learn language, there may be further things. But if you end up using each model as the way of understanding the next, then all you have to do is have it be that you end up using the body movement model as a high bandwidth way of understanding people's intentions. I think that this is, you're just going to have seeing how people are going to move. I think that coming to this sort of, right now we're like, of varying ages, but I'd say none of us is 0 years old or 1 year old. So it's easy to forget what that was like. And I actually think that the early on, like when you think about what babies are doing, they're like sitting there looking at things, and at that point, they're not going to have psychological blocks that are really highly correlated with a lot of the things happening around them. It may be that babies are deeply constrained to believe that they're unified with everything. It's still the case that they're building models and going to be receiving tons of information. And so I think what ends up happening is we build super detailed models here, and then we end up stacking tons of other stuff on top of it, which makes it so that we frequently don't have contact with this material that is still understood implicitly. Because it's implicit, because the stuff in the mind is not subconscious, is not permanently unconscious in the relevant regard, but it's understood implicitly, it is possible to draw your attention to the thing and notice facts about it. So long as you, Wolf, yeah, go ahead.
Just on the building of sort of high bandwidth models,
Yeah.
I think learning to ride a bike is also gonna be like this.
Yeah.
That you end up like, the way you control a bike, which way it goes is like kind of mysterious. Like you can take your hands off the handlebars and still steer the thing. You sort of know what's going on, but
Yeah.
but like there is this phenomenon of the mind being able to like deeply get locked in with some external system
Yeah.
through very subtle cues.
Yeah, I think that's a good example. Actually, I hadn't
So it's
thought of
not
that.
just
So yeah,
it's not
so
just it's not just like body stuff.
riding a bike, even just picking up a cup, being able to hold the cup like gently without dropping it, and being able to do that reliably. There's going to be all of this like very subtle stuff happening. I think we see signs of people being tuned in to each other's intentions, like. So I think this is like the phenomenon of personal space, where you can feel like you're in somebody's space. And it's not like it's whenever you're exactly 18 centimeters or 18 inches or whatever away. It's going to be different people feel like they take up different amounts of space, and by looking at them, and by interacting with them, you can get a sense of this. Give me one sec. So we've also a number of us have done experiments with this, where when energy healers talk about seeing each other's energy. If you just take that to refer to the person's intention with regard to how much space they're filling, then you end up with something that it looks like people can learn to read off of one another. I've spent time teaching people where I'll change it to be that I'm filling the room, or I'll change it to be that I'm only filling the space at the edge of my skin, or that I'm filling space in a way that like just goes narrowly and directly at them. And then people are relatively reliably able to pick this out. It is the sort of thing that you have to learn how to do, and people will frequently have a sort of subtle, sort of native sense of how to do this, though sometimes you have to locate that how to do the thing. So this, I think that what's happening is that I as yet have no need for the postulation of more mystical or sort of extravagant mechanisms. I think just having this model built early on causes people to have a high bandwidth way of picking up facts about intentions from other people. Wolf.
Yeah, and extending on the bandwidth comments, just a theoretical point. If you're transmitting, language is kind of transmitting things with, like it's closer to computer coding, except in conversation, but like written language, for example, it's like one way there's no feedback effect unless you have to like include a lot more material to make sure you got all the pieces. But when you have a mind on the other end and you have two-way communication, you can actually get way higher compression, such that like a few yes/no questions going both ways can actually build out substantially large models on each end, because the models are, while being complex in the size of the model, they're not improbable.
Okay,
and thus like you can get basically this is a mechanism by which you can get way more content transfer than you would expect.
Okay.
Because you're able to compress it so much because there's a mind on both ends.
Yeah, okay, so that's a really good observation. So I think I would I'm using, when I say high bandwidth, I'm not carefully distinguishing between actually high bandwidth versus low bandwidth with high interpretive ability, right? So if you look at, you could either call high bandwidth how much throughput is there measured by number of bits across the channel, versus bit rate versus, total compression. I think that it's something like, surprisingly high bandwidth and also really surprisingly high receptive ability yields shockingly high total sort of receptivity.
Yeah.
Okay, so if we postulate something like this, then we get the energy healing mechanism. All that's happening is the person is looking at you and seeing, based on how much space you're filling and other sorts of things, what your intention is. And then so one of the things that happens in training is that you have one person transfer an intention to the other person. So the intention has to do with what you expect will happen, and by interacting with the person, you can change their expectations about what's going to happen. and there are sort of further mechanisms that I think are involved here, but at least we know that can happen, and then the question is just, can that happen without words at a distance? Well, sure. So, you look at the person, and you, get their attention, and then, no, it's you, Zoe, and then you, you can, and so you can see that if I, go like this, it's clear that I'm reaching for something, and it's, precise. And I'm not actually going to push this further, but but by things.
Blocks up.
What?
So haircut blocks up. Man.
Yep, no, that's right. So the cue the idea of wizard battles.
Oh my God, energy shields.
Well, it's an interesting question because maybe the person just can. You put up your energy shields, but now are immobilized, right? So maybe they can do this while running at you with a sword. This adds an entirely new dimension to competitive play, where it could be. You think I'm kidding?
Just so happy.
What? You're just looking for full spectrum dominance, James.
I did find a bunch of my energy concepts in memories of wrestling with my brothers and knowing how to move my hands so that they would react slowest because they would be most confused. So going in their defenses is one of these energy waves.
For what it's worth, I'm familiar with this one in fighting as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yep. Kersey is familiar from fighting.
It's
yeah.
also the case that the immobilization thing is maybe not referenced, as a direct technical model, but in mythology and stocks, it's frequently the case that there are immobilization type powers connected to energy or magic or this kind of.
So there appears to be background support from mythology, and actually I think that one shouldn't discount this. It's notable, and I've remarked on this, but not everybody has heard this, and I love this so much that indulge me for the 30 seconds. This explains wizards, right? So, you've got the person with the cloak hiding their body and the hat shielding their eyes. They come in and encounter someone who is their adversary. They're shielded so that the other person can't read their intention, either off of their body or off of their expression. But then they throw back the cloak, their face is revealed.
Naked,
they pull up. That would produce one type of effect. They then raise their hands and do the energy healing activity, except not directed at healing, instead directed at finding the weakness in the other person's intention, the place where the other person expects to be defeated, and will act in accordance with that, and then uses that to cause to drive the person's mind in a direction that is contrary to what you might think of as the achievement of their goals. I think that is something for which we now have a fully mechanistic model. And then when you hear about magical traditions in the past, it's like where the people just, doing magic tricks, or was they just would get together and say a bunch of sort of ritual statements that didn't really do anything, and why were they so popular at times, and how do you get people involved in a club where you just have a bunch of fake magic, and you get traditions and so forth? If you postulate that the people actually have some technical discipline that they're developing that is powerful and that can be used in various ways, then I think you get a much more sensible explanation of what's happening in the past. Yes?
Another point on the combat use of this, Dima's martial arts stuff that he was doing had a heavy emphasis on building up this thing he called dialogue, which was why we're doing all that stuff with our hands, letting our hands track each other. And he, and so I remember this being basically almost the entirety of the focus was on building up this dialogue thing and then being able to exploit the holes in the other person's I'm not sure what he called it, but basically the intention. And so that was definitely what Dima was trying to teach us at least at one point.
Yeah, and so and I think that this then gives a sort of underpinning for the warriors meet one another, study each other, and then one of them bows, and that is the end of the match. Or it's like the people, it is at least conceivable that with high bandwidth reads, the people can so there's a question as to how far this actually gets pushed in reality. We're not sure, but it does seem like a good research project.
Yeah, one note on the martial arts thing is that there are multiple martial arts traditions that emphasize the dialogue and like figuring out the other person's intention and like moving inside of it, they appear to largely not work. I believe that this is because they're degenerate institutions where if you don't have technical models, you can't update your plan of what works as people's like bodies and minds change, and this results in many traditions like acupuncture, like these martial arts traditions, that the general like more like Wuian communication space to fail over time because industrialization and Western society is going to change people's body plans.
Yeah, so
This
you
is
could.
an interesting claim that like if those traditions were heuristical traditions based on empirical regularities, but they didn't have deep models, then when they run across a warrior from a totally different tradition, they just can't defeat him because they actually none of their tricks work on him. And that's why MMA always wins in these
And
things.
you can also have that the. Go ahead, Jason.
I was just gonna say that, so New Thought, and people are probably familiar with the famous video of the guy who was practicing this, getting defeated by someone. I wonder if what's going on is if you're only training with your students, and then your students aren't actually trying to beat you, they're just trying to sync with you. You don't get the real, you develop something like this that works, but all your students have this terrible weakness, which is that they don't want to defeat the master.
Well, and then you could imagine that most combat occurs on that level, where that what's happening is it's already decided whose intention has bent to whom, and so by the time you meet on the battlefield, it is already decided. The person who meets you on the battlefield either has the intention to defeat you or the intention to be defeated by you in a particular way, and then if you want,
There's a book about this, I think, The Western Way of War, I think, that postulates that in Europe in particular, translating roughly, I haven't actually read the book, and I'm not really an expert in this stuff, but translating roughly that the European way of war has a heavy emphasis in like desacralizing and like disregarding the other guy's intentions, such that you can't have these.
This is what Conan the Barbarian is about in part.
The rule of steel. This is the riddle of steel.
Right. No, it's you smash the other person with reality and choose to disregard their intention, and then this causes people to none of their sort of intention-based warfare paradigms work, and thus the West sort of can't be.
And so there's an interesting question as to empirically or in particular contexts, do you sync with the person's intention or do you not? And if you do, there will be advantages and disadvantages, and if you don't, there will be advantages and disadvantages. If you don't sync with their intention, then you may not know it. And if you don't know it, well, there's an interesting question. How much communication do you really want there to be between you and another person? It feels like this is relevant, so I'll just mention, because I haven't mentioned this to everyone. When you start thinking about intentions, you get interesting formulations for how to engage in combat or in adversarial contests. My current formulation is to stand in the opponent's blind spots, learn the opponent's intention, learn where they expect to be beaten, and become the thing they expect to beat them. And if the opponent has no blind spots and has a perfect intention, then kneel.
Unless you have superior force.
Then they won't fight you. Because they have no blind spots and they have the right intention.
I worry that your combat paradigm developed too much produces continual patterns of each person defeating the other, because it's not the case that there just has to be one victor. You could imagine that everyone comes to exploit everyone else's blind spots and all conflict.
Well, I will say that I do not have a fully developed combat paradigm, so let's check in later on that. Okay, I want to talk briefly about joint introspection, which is another completely hilarious sort of thing that happens in this area. So we started noticing effects where you have two people, trainer sitting there with trainee, and then the trainee changes their, gains introspective access, and the trainer, who is at the time introspecting on something, also gains greater introspective access at the time. So there are these sort of like weird sort of synchronization type events. And then this is something that can be purposefully employed. So if you end up with the relevant sort of intention sync, then so I was in one context where I was working with somebody and they were having trouble introspecting on a particular thing. So I suggested that we both find the corresponding thing in our own minds, and got the relevant sync, and then moved my mind to the relevant thing in my own mind, which then caused them to introspect. this was a really interesting interaction. Later, the person was having trouble introspecting again, and so I did a different variation, which is that I brought my attention to the thing, which caused them to bring their attention to the thing. And then there was another variation where bringing the person's attention to the thing wasn't actually the right thing. What was necessary was bringing their attention to the way that they found the thing, but I forgot what it was. So I then formed the intention to have them drag both me and them to the relevant thing. And then as soon as I formed the intention, then it happened. So yeah, weird. But all you need for it is that there's adequately high bandwidth sort of between people, such that people's intentions are trying to sync up, such that then when one moves, the other moves. All right, well, yeah.
You can imagine like offense defense setups where you have a group that is very isolated from each other, so that it's like totally modular, so that if it gets smashed from the outside, it's not like the morale doesn't get shaken.
Yeah. So it's actually really interesting. So when you think about sort of modern society, atomized individuals, compartmentalized minds, people will be less affected by this, and being less affected by this then has pros and cons. Maybe you get less sort of intention rippling, which I'll talk about, but it's also the case that the people are more isolated from one another. You get less positive effects as well. I mean, it could be that magic, in the sense of the relevant traditions, died out both because there's problems with failure of tradition, but it may be that people just became less susceptible to it because of industrialization and the way it set up people's minds. Okay, so now I want to talk about an important question, which is who started it? This is a question that frequently comes up in interactions, where person A and person B are interacting, and person A, and person B meet, and now person B is upset. And why is person B upset? Well, maybe they didn't realize that they were upset, but person A is like, okay, you should introspect, and it's like, oh yeah, okay, yeah, no, I am upset. What am I upset about? Well, I'm upset about this thing you're doing. Person A is like, I'm not doing a thing. It's like, okay, we should introspect, blah, blah, blah. Okay, yeah, actually, I am doing a thing. In fact, it was the thing that you said. But I'm doing that because you're doing this other thing. Like, I'm not doing this other. Okay, well, maybe I am doing this thing, but no. But this is because of a thing that you did. Where here it's not like a historical record, it's a thing that's happening at the time. So intentions are quite complicated. You can have a person be excited and then have squished that so that now they are, hopeless, but then overriding it so that now they're there again, trying to be excited and then, distracting themselves from this thing while paying attention. Like, you can get all of these complicated structures. The current way that I think about this is that you get person A and person B, and they have some stack of intentions. And then there's actually not just a sort of single intention, or rather, they don't have a disposition to have only a single intention. Maybe they do have their perceived or expected plan, but they also have all these dispositions to actualize different intentions based on what happens. So maybe you punch them and now they have a different intention, or you make it look like you're going to punch them and they have it, and they have an intention for reacting to that. Or, now you are like calm and soothing, or maybe you are like, disconnected and official. And then people have all of these different ways that they respond to them. Well, I think then what ends up happening is that when two people meet, they end up actualizing intentions in one another that lock together on enough levels. How many levels? I'm not sure. How quickly does this happen? I don't know. How frequently? Not really sure. And then also how deeply? Does this, when two people meet, do they sync on the sort of most fundamental intention with regard to the nature of the universe? And that then helps to determine all of the other things that they sync with respect to. I don't know yet, but as we've looked into this, it looks like there's a lot of sync, and so I'm inclined to think that people very frequently sync up very quickly, very deeply, and that the result isn't determined by one or the other person, but rather by something like the dispositions rifle. You sort of like run through a whole bunch of options when you initially encounter each other, and then it locks into place. And then that determines what's going to happen in the interaction. Notably, the place where this will occur in CT, there's this place that's notably indeterminate, which is at the point of example generation. It's not that CT says that it's in self-indeterminate, it's just that the examples that get produced, or the ideas that come up, are determined by many, many different factors and many subtle factors, and so we don't have the ability now to predict what idea a person will have in what context. Well, so it could be that people actually, when they encounter each other, end up transmitting a very large amount of information about intentions, and these things very quickly then end up syncing up in some pattern, such that the ideas that are produced for what to do next originate from that. And so it could be that you met with a person and it just happened that you thought to talk about X, or you just happened to be reminded of that thing that they did, which was super annoying. Of course, you happened to be reminded of it because your intention locked to theirs, and they happened to remember a corresponding thing, which made it so that they had a subtle thing that then you saw, and then now you're annoyed and they're annoyed. Or maybe it happens in a nice way, and you were expecting it to go badly, but actually the way the intentions sync up, you end up actualizing the dispositions towards having a nice and fruitful conversation. Yes?
So an interesting thing that might be a demonstration of this is that if you think of acting as not being about a bunch of emotions and two people pretending to be other people, but actually being about two actors who have been trained to hold particular intentions and the audience observing the interaction of these intentions, then what you can do is you can analyze a text from your character's point of view so as to generate from the text the correct intention and have the other person generate from the text the correct intention that is contained in the text, such that when you act it out and the two intentions interact, it meshes perfectly with the text in a way that you couldn't have preconceived, but always ends up making sense, even if every time it's slightly different. So you end up with, every time you act a scene, it's supposed to be different from all the other times, otherwise it's not live, it's not real. But it always, if you've picked the right intentions, will end up matching the text in a way that is interesting and unique, but works.
Yeah, so that's a great example. I hadn't thought about the application to acting. This is another. So you'll note that with this, with
All of this is acting. It's all acting.
One day we'll see.
Even this.
So and so you'll note that as I'm talking about these different phenomena, it's like there's like a lot of like, oh yeah, it looks like that's happening here and this is happening here. If these phenomena are real, then they should be pervasive, and so you should just be expecting to see things like this all over the place. I currently think that the way that training interaction should work is that trainers should render themselves adequately responsive and have a huge range of action, potential things that they can do, such that they end up syncing with the other person's intention in the right way, which then yields the correct training interaction. So it's like the same thing as acting, except you're doing training instead of holding intentions that are revealed by a particular script. But I think that's a great example. So this, it's an interesting question as to whether it is possible to determine who started it. There will certainly be legible signs like one person threw the first punch, but the and you could imagine that it's too difficult to have systems of law based or rules based on the subtle things because they vary too much, and so then you lay down some official legible things like the person who started it was the one who threw the first punch. Where then people end up with a whole bunch of intentions to cause the other person to disregard the rules and punch them. And it's an interesting question, who started it, though the law has an opinion in that case. So I think that it could be that there's like a pretty easy and straightforward way to determine what will happen in an interaction. I do think lots of interactions are fairly predictable, but it's an interesting question of whether they're predictable because both people are coming in with a preset intention, which includes not responding to the other person and not responding to the other person's not responding to them. When you start thinking about what if humans are interactive in this way, such that their intentions link up with each other, then you might expect that professionalism is a totally sort of alien thing. where what you do is you train yourself to behave in the appropriate ways no matter what the other person does. The other person has spit on your shoe, and you respond professionally. And that's because you are not allowing anything coming in from the other side to determine more than that you will take 3 different actions, either giving them the TPS report, asking for the TPS report, or saying that you're not sure, you'll ask with your manager. So it could be that what's happening is that interactions are actually substantially more predictable because people have already synced on not interacting with each other very much. And so they are interacting, but in this sort of like not interacting very much way.
Can I add another?
Yes.
So if that's the case, which I think something like that makes sense, then another example from acting that's interesting is that part of what your intention is meant to contain is basically that the other person's actual reactions, like the person, not like a character, are highly, highly relevant to you on a very fine grain to how well your plan is going. And so you have to pay very, very close attention to them to see if you're getting the thing that you want. It's all based in their behavior. And then I think that the reason why, so like why do people go and watch acting, and why is acting sometimes shitty and why is it sometimes good? It's boring to watch people being professional with each other, but watching people have to be that responsive means that every second there's uncertainty and there's unpredictability, and the thing could go a million minute new directions within perhaps the container of both of these intentions. And so attention gets dragged to this, basically. I think it's like, this is the kind of thing that everyone goes, what's happening? There's like something new going on, as opposed to like, we're on script and the script is blocking,
Okay.
it's boring and no one gives a shit about watching that.
Okay, yeah, that also seems useful. James.
It's worth saying in connection with that there are some scripts which will have people acting professionally, but then they will also be acting in a subterranean way.
Right.
Contingency. And this is in fact what happens with most professional interactions. Right? It's very important to look at the amount that no one is allowed to talk about rather than no one is allowed to actually sync on.
Okay, and so this is interesting. There's a further thing here, which is that, so the point in case the camera didn't pick it up is that, you know, you can have it be that people act in a professional way, but then there's the sort of intention transfer occurring underneath, and that a lot of the important information is there. I think there's a pattern generally, sociologically, where you have people who are in the more responsive paradigm. They then add some surface level of rigidity that then allows them to outperform the people who are just being responsive. But then they train the next generation, and the next generation learns the rigid thing without learning the responsive thing. And so you can imagine, a bunch of more responsive people adopting professionalism and that working, and then they raise kids who don't have the responsive thing and are just professional, and now it's dead and less. And I think that this is a more general pattern where mechanization produces a short-term benefit and then a long-term harm. This relates to vibes and vibe reads. If in fact there's high bandwidth transfer of the relevant information, then you have the information. You aren't drawing your attention to it, maybe you are, and then there's a question as to how much can be articulated. I'm going to return to this, but the short answer is, I think, yes. Like, you're getting a ton of information, and it can be articulated.
Also, people looking like their pets after like years and years of having the same pet. I think this is
Oh yeah. I think this is true. And there's an interesting question of how two-way it is. Like, does the pet turn more to be like the person,
I actually
or
think
does
it's
the
that.
person?
I think it's often that, because a lot of people are not so good at that, especially if they're really fucking old. I mean, people, whatever.
Yeah. Okay.
Pets probably have more compliance paths than in some
They
cases.
also probably communicate on this level a lot more than people because they don't have the verbal option, basically.
Yeah.
So
Well,
the
where's
pets
the
are
nuance
just
coming
seeking
from?
dominance on a non-verbal level. They have a sharper intention than
Or
any of us.
sync on a non-verbal level.
Okay. Willow.
It seems like there's two slightly different skill sets here, which is the ability to pick up on and interact with the other person's intention, and then the ability to add new things to the other person's intention.
Yep.
Which is like, I think the thing I've encountered a lot is that it requires either some degree of unresponsiveness to affect the other person's attention, such that if you're just completely responsive, you're going to be not, like, I don't know, I've experienced this to some degree, like not being able to like bring in new pieces because they don't fit, or having like a detailed and nuance, so you know exactly how the piece could fit in, and then can like move the other person over. Do you have an understanding of this skill set?
Yeah.
Like, things involved in the latter skill set?
Yeah. So I do think that there are two important things here. So this is one of the how do you unify the two things? They seem to be opposed to each other. One of them is responsiveness. The other one is rigidity. If you are fully responsive, then you just follow. And so then, unless the people's intentions around you are adequately good, you'll just end up doing the things that they do that don't make sense. Rigidity, on the other hand, allows you to stick to something that does make sense and is good, despite other people not doing that. But then you also lose a bunch of benefits from the responsiveness, including sort of the amount of information you get from them. The diagram that I always draw, which someone pointed out may not be fully clear, so I will make it clear. There's the basic goals, here's you. Then the thing that I think one should try to aim for is the maximum skill on both is on the rigidity side to identify the things that are in fact necessary and to be able to understand the necessity of the things so well that it is completely unshakable and you don't need to fortify it. Like when you understand that 2 is not 3, you don't need to defend it with IPs. You don't need to draw your attention away. Other people can be like, 2 is 3, we found out. Physicists have determined, they used the Higgs boson, they found that, 2 is equal to 3. It doesn't shake you. And at least for many people, it will not shake them. And that is because they very solidly grasp the necessity of the truth that 2 is not equal to 3. I think that in general, you can use different intellectual procedures. You might think of this as reason to set yourself up to, I think the best version is to, in the lightest weight possible way, meaning not needing to be fortified with continued intellectual processes, to grasp the necessity of things that are in fact necessary. And so, on the way to achieving your basic goals, you have something that is in fact necessary, and some other thing which is in fact necessary, but there's 2. And then, if these are in fact necessary, then you want to be rigid in those regards and not rigid in the other regards. Then, if you imagine that the person is otherwise responsive, then what happens is the person will come to fit the relevant circumstance, but doing so in a way that they still foresee that they will end up hitting the relevant necessary points. And so then what will end up happening is that their behavior might change in whatever sort of way, except it will, their projected future of the world will in fact pass through here, 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 and here. And so then the thing can vary sort of a whole lot otherwise. And so this is the thing that I think is the ideal to aim for and unifies the virtues of responsiveness and the virtues of rigidity. Yes?
Dima had a bunch of content on this. His thing about the dialogue or intention sync. He emphasized not being rigid and not just being a wall ever, but always looking for the way that they push you, but you kind of loop around and come back to the objective in a way that basically that there's going to be holes in their intention, or that the way they're pushing, it's you're always in a state of responsive dialogue, but then also you're kind of iterating back and forth on who's pushing in what way, what intentions are being communicated, such that it actually ends up being a little bit like a negotiation, and you end up definitely achieving your thing without ever being rigid.
And I think that translates to you are rigid only on the necessary point, which is your victory.
Yeah, and then what that translates, how the squiggly section ends up
this
is
you moving forward and you moving back and you taking a swing versus you
and
dodging their thing.
And you always do that, you respond to their immediate action and to their plan in such a way that you always have a plan that results in your achieving the objective.
Yeah.
And you just go back and forth until keeping that axiom.
Yeah, I think that's right. Zoe?
Yeah, I was just going to say a simple way to put it is that in acting they distinguish between the end goal or the final moment that you want, which you visualize very, very specifically and vividly before you begin to act the scene. You picture the other person in the state that you want them in. or understanding the thing you want them to understand, and you make a distinction between the end game and then all of the tactics. And basically, all my teachers would basically yell at you if you were not being responsive about the tactics. They're like, it's not working, it's not working, it's not working. Like, you're not getting what you want.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's another way.
Cool.
another
Yeah.
distinction.
That it seems like that fits. Okay, so that's neat. That covers who started it. The answer is we don't know. And then in terms of so then I guess one last part, Willow, in answer to your question, the way you introduce something new is through the recognition of the necessity of a different thing happening, and better, the recognition of a specific thing that needs to happen. And then it is possible to smooth, like people usually have, like they will have their current intention and the anticipated next steps and so on. But usually there are many different dispositions that can be actualized. And so it's like the person who is angry is going to expect you to not say the thing, and then they will storm out and then be sad. But while they're angry, they also have other things that, if those things happen, sort of naturally work with the logic of anger. Like I like looking at emotions where if you think about, like, take poutiness. Poutiness has a particular logic to it. Like the pouty person is expecting a certain, so and there's a way to interact with poutiness where you don't fulfill the thing and the person pouts more. And there's a way where you're like, oh no, here's the thing, and then they're like, oh okay. And so if you think about poutiness as having multiple sort of lines forward, the same thing's true for anger, the same thing's true for most things. In fact, in almost all circumstances, you can just, wait, hold on one sec. You can do something like that, where you just like break the thing in a minor way and ask for a brief break. Or like, you're like, oh, I have to check a thing. Or something like that. Like, this is something that most interactions have room for. And so then if you want to still be responsive while working inside the other person's intention and get where you're going, then you want to find the unactualized dispositions in their states, and then actualize those. And so it's like, well, the person's pouty, and so if you change the subject and speak professionally, then you aren't interacting with any of the sort of dispositions contained in poutiness. But maybe you could suggest that you could decide to give the person the thing or not give the person the thing, but with the intention being that you'll find a way through the maze of their potential intentions that get you where you're going. In some cases, you also just want to break off from the person and do your own thing. It is an interest. Then there's a question of when you do which.
I can also imagine that if someone's things are responsive and not based on reality, then you could do a thing where you're like, I'm going to do the professionalism thing now, which requires, because it doesn't sync off to any of the things they want to do, then it like actually requires them to start acting in a different way if they're going to be responsive to the thing.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So yeah, depending on how responsive the person is, you can then either lead or follow, and then sometimes you can just lead them to a different thing. Okay, so let's just make this much weirder now. I think that so if this is all happening where you've got these detailed models of bodies and how bodies move in such a way that you end up with high bandwidth information transferred through intention, like is it only through bodies? Well, no. I mean, I think that if you look at, when you can have things that are similar, like tone of voice and pacing and so forth, but you can also just have word choice. Like, people use different words, and like you can see people just sort of like, endlessly fighting over the exact phrasing of a thing because the subtle differences in the phrasings all indicate different things. In fact, it's not just phrasings that reveal intention. Like, look, for example, at that chair. That chair, so Anya impressed this point on me, I think it's a very good point. You can see intention from the aesthetics of things. And so you see a chair that is functional, but like clearly nobody really put a lot of effort into the thing. I actually really liked Samo's read on the aesthetics of Apple, where you have an unquestionable hierarchy, an object is presented, there is no interaction with the designers. The thing is meant to be perfect, though not by any sort of human standard. It had a designer, or it may have had a designer, so you could have designed by so-and-so, but this wasn't designed in accordance with their taste. And etc. I think if you think about Trader Joe's, where you'll see like a little Trader Joe's with like a registered symbol, and it's like you feel good about Trader Joe's. Like why? Well, it's like a little more personal. Of course, you do understand the fact that this is a corporation, and if there actually is a Trader Joe, you don't really want to know who they are. Like that makes it like too personal. It's like much more that you're interacting with this soulless corporation, but at least you want it to be made nice for you. And so the idea that maybe it's a bit personal makes it so that you can have the sort of capital letters with Trader Joe's and then have the sort of registered symbol there at the same time, right? So I actually think that you can read an incredibly large amount of information about intention off of essentially everything. And if you really have all of these sort of, if people are extremely attuned to facts about intention, or I guess I should add a further piece to this, so I'm going to probably go till 1:45. Try to finish by 1:40. So let's add in the fact that so there's questions as to what are people's basic goals. And we've got the standard list. There's the idea of unity at the end of time. Mia has this interesting formulation, which is that people's basic goals are universal connection and universal coordination. Well, if that's right, one way you could think about it is that the mind starts off with like a very simple model. That universal coordination and connection is achieved. That's all, there's nothing. Then, as you gain information, instead of like building a model of like a tree and a sun and sort of like, building these together in some sort of network diagram, you could imagine that, and I need a better sort of physical metaphor for this, but you could imagine that it's sort of like, this was like a sort of piece of gum that instead of just adding another thing and connecting it, you imagine sort of stretching the thing out. So it's like the person has the achievement of the state, or this can be expanded out so that now you have where they are and the achievement of the state. And then you could expand it further so that sort of like the material that the mind's model is being built inside of is something that has as a limiting condition that the whole thing heads towards universal connection and coordination. I don't know if that specific sort of metaphor will manage to convey it, but at the very least, if you have people who, so different sort of picture, if you have people who are aimed at connection and coordination, and they have spotty self-efficacy, which definitely seems to be true, then if you have two people, and here's how one person achieves universal connection and coordination, then, well, another person will only have so much self-efficacy to allow them to disagree with, to fail to coordinate with, and to fail to understand other people. Like if connection involves mutual understanding, then things will be understood at the end, people will understand each other at the end, and they also will be coordinated. So if you don't have the ability to launch an independent initiative or understand something on your own, so the way of thinking about it is if you don't have the ability to create something that others will be able to be brought to understand, you won't then be able to understand that thing either, because you will not expect that the thing will be understood. And so if you don't believe that you can come back into coordination, then you won't take a further step outside of the original coordination. And so then what will happen is the degree to which people can be desynct from one another is limited by their self-efficacy. And even if somebody has self-efficacy that allows them to go pretty far away on some particular point, it might be that they have low self-efficacy with being able to disagree with or understand things differently with other people on a whole bunch of points. And so what you should expect with imperfect high self-efficacy is you should expect that people all throughout their plans are expecting to be connected and coordinated with other people. They either think it's happening now, or they think it's about to happen as soon as they change, and they instantly change into the state, or they're going to take one step, and then they're going to be connected and coordinated with other people. Thank you, Brian, for it. if this is happening, then you should expect people to be incredibly attuned to this sort of information. If you build models in accordance with what you think will happen and what's happening is the universal movement towards connection and coordination, then the functional ontology of the entire model is how things are going to sync up. And you're only going to be able to sort of move apart from that insofar as you've sort of developed an independent capacity to both move out and move back. What you should then expect is there being, sort of combine all these ideas together, you should expect there being high bandwidth transmission of intention information through an entire civilization. So it's not just two people, it's going to be everyone. And then there is a question of how fast, how thorough, etc. If the mechanism is sufficiently fast, sufficiently thorough, sufficiently deep, transmitted by sufficiently many things, then you end up with this idea of general intention transfer, which is where everyone in society is all syncing up with everyone else very quickly on a particular thing. Give me a second. Now, you might think that well, we look around and we see that people actually aren't synced up. Look, you have the atheists and you have the Christians, and they're not synced up with one another. But the thing that people might be syncing up on might be rather complex. And so it might be that, I think a better way to think about this, something like there's a script that's being distributed. The script has different roles in it, and people identify which one they are in it, and then they act in accordance with that. The atheists and the Christians both agree how the atheists will behave, and they both agree how the Christians behave. And they also agree that Christianity is dying, and they also both think that that's sort of a sad thing. They both think that that's a sad thing. They both think that people will be morally worse for it, et cetera, et cetera. And so so if this is right, then what you should expect is that in a sufficiently responsive group, you should expect this phenomenon to occur. Now I just want to, so is it fast? Let me get you afterwards. Okay, so my attention was drawn to this because I noted that in our group we started having simultaneous discovery. Was it really simultaneous discovery? Maybe it wasn't. Maybe just like there were lots of information channels I didn't know about, or maybe. And so then it started to seem really eerie. You had like 3 different people having the same idea at the same time. The idea of simultaneous discovery was noted by multiple people at the same time. It like keeps happening. And so maybe what's happening is that you have a phenomenon like this, where the where our group is experiencing this general intention transfer. This, of course, makes us think of Girard. Girard has some weird things to say. I will briefly sketch. Girard's primary model, so Girard believes in this thing which he calls mimesis, or sort of imitativeness. Girard believes that you have people and that there's a sort of particular way that they interact that unfolds in all sort of pre-civilization societies or groups, where a person wants a thing, like an apple, and the other person imitates them as regards the object of their desire. So they also want the apple. But now there is conflict, and so this person attacks this person who imitates and attacks back. But you also have other people in the society as well, and these people also imitate. This leads to a society-wide sort of total war, which then threatens to destroy everything. At some point, a third party has violence directed at them, and everyone else imitates, directing violence at that person. That person is destroyed, and now there's no object there to imitate. As soon as that happens, the violence ceases. According to Girard, when this happens, this is like a miracle. There is like this terrible thing happened and now it's stopped. The people identify this person as in some way the cause, because why else would killing that person prevent the thing? And this then, according to Girard, becomes the origin of all ritual and taboo, where you taboo the things that led up to the initial battle. So you taboo, eating certain types of foods. You taboo, you limit the way people have sex with each other, and then ritual involves the attempt to reenact the event which saved the civilization, and so you'll have ritual fighting. And you'll have things like, and so then when you actually go through and look at tribes and different groups, they have just such crushingly weird things going on. Like there's it's like, why do they do this thing? Well, they believe in the rain god because, they need it to rain, and this is like a nice explanation instead of like clouds. And it's like, okay, sure, maybe there's some of that, but how on earth do you explain the occurrence of, for instance, there's one society where the able-bodied men once a year run away, they are chased, the people capture one of them, that person is then made into their king, they are allowed to eat the forbidden foods, they are allowed to have sex in whatever patterns they want, and then after a predetermined time, then the person is sacrificed. What is that explaining? Like, that's not explaining weather patterns, okay? That's just like very, very weird. And when you look at the sort of like different things going on, so this is sort of the evidence that led Girard to postulate this. I currently am toying with the hypothesis that things that seem eerie enough are eerie because there is a ring of truth. And there's something that's extremely eerie about this theory, at least I find it quite eerie. I initially heard this from Thiel and was like, okay, no, because we've got CT and CT doesn't support the idea of mimesis. I do think that the microdynamics will not end up being the same, but notably this idea of general intention transfer yields the sort of thing that should produce these mimetic effects. So if Girard postulated that there was a very large amount of unconscious information that people had that they were acting on that was super, super difficult, that they could not access, that was causing these effects, that would lead to imitative competition, that would lead to scapegoating, lead to taboos and rituals and so forth. And so in watching the change, so the interesting thing is that we do have introspective access to a notable degree, and this has allowed, so you can sit there and you can do the social articulation activity on the group and figure out what's happening, what's changing so as to cause simultaneously these people to all have the same ideas. If idea generation is going to be prompted by intentions, and intentions are being transferred through the group in this high bandwidth way, then you would expect to get simultaneous discovery. I suspect that the examination of the general intention transfer is going to yield it will yield the effects of scapegoating, or it will produce that this is a phenomenon. It will produce the competitive imitative cycles, and I think more generally will lead to a CT-compliant theory of group dynamics. So I expect there to be a lot of discussion of this, and then there are some interesting questions about it. If this is right, then to what degree, so tying this into the idea of social articulation, earlier, a year ago, we started looking way more into this idea of articulating the sort of social information packet, where it looked like you could look at what society thinks about things. And it takes a little while to get people to sync up on it, and some people seem to have more or less trouble accessing it. But once you do end up syncing up on the thing, people end up producing shockingly similar reads. It looked like there was this weird piece of information that people usually weren't consciously accessing and articulating that had tons and tons of information about what was happening in society. That seems to correspond super nicely to Girard's idea of there being this unconscious piece of information. And then if you note that for the most part, people aren't desynced. So if there is this information packet, it's a notable question why people aren't talking about it. Well, I think the answer is that most people are synced to it in such a way that they are playing their role in the script, and the script doesn't tell them to talk about it, so they don't. I think that the people who detach themselves from the thing usually do so with sufficient force that then they don't draw their attention back to it. You'd have to have it be that you had a sufficiently desynced but sufficiently interested group or person that would make it so that it was possible to go back in and access the relevant material. And we have in fact found that there appears to be a shockingly large amount of information accessible through social articulation, that people seem to be surprisingly synced up on it. There are ways that there appear to be errors. We can sort of talk through error model in a different context because we're almost out of time. And it seems to get weirdly specific. And when we were doing social articulation with Thiel on Palantir, I produced that Peter Thiel runs Palantir. which is weird because Alex Karp runs Palantir. But then again, I'm not sure that the social packet knows about Alex Karp. But it does know about Palantir and it does know about Peter Thiel. And then interestingly, Thiel pulled up a headline from a couple days earlier where it's Bloomberg, Peter Thiel's Palantir knows everything about you, should you worry? That's interesting. And it's not that people, if this information packet thing is right, it's not that people have no access to it. It's that it's driving their actions, and that whenever people make movies, if you want to speak in the vocabulary that people will understand, it's like I think that artists, in particular, production of movies, TV shows, things like this. I think journalists, in order to have something sound right, are going to be speaking from this. I think that lots and lots of people will just be speaking from the social information packet. And so this sort of ties the thing together. So the overall theory is that the high bandwidth individual information transfer that's occurring between individuals and can be intervened on in all of these interesting ways is actually a cross society, or sort of across the entire world, sort of syncing mechanism that involves there being a large amount of information that is difficult but possible to access. And then this just raises a bunch of really interesting questions, like one interesting thing to think about is what role do we show up in the social information packet? To what degree is our intention synced with everybody else's? It's a little bit hard to say. There's this weird phenomenon of nobody seeming to remember what we do, no matter how many times we tell them. Weird. Yes.
On that point, and also some previous ones, the connectivity graph is going to be very important to which intentions sync up and how. And the connectivity graph is one of the big politically contentious things, in particular who controls the TV stations. Basically there's going to be some nodes that have outsized effect on the thing. And so let's say the ruling class controls the TV stations roughly. Then everyone else's intentions get synced up with the intentions of the ruling class because they're broadcasting. But and then on the leverage thing, and on generally isolating yourself, once you cut the ties so that things aren't flowing one way or the other, then you can cease having a place in the narrative, and a lot of these effects can be cut off. There's
an interesting question as to whether you cut them off or whether you merely sort of mediate them in a particular way.
Sure. So I think back to the Nazi wizards example, where we ran into people using crazy magic that we didn't understand, but we knew that if we just cut off connectivity, the problems would cease.
Well, so there is a question as to the connectivity graph. I think that's super important. It's also, I think, there's going to be a question as to how high bandwidth this is. You could imagine that it's sufficiently high bandwidth that something happens and a person walks through a room and everyone picks up on the fact that something has happened, but the total amount of different things that could have happened is sufficiently low that everyone already knows that the thing has happened and then has updated relevantly, but just can't say that because it's only a feeling and you only want to say things that sort of seem like they're justified. So you could imagine that it actually, media sure is there as part of the thing, but it could be that the connectivity graph is so dense that media ends up playing a lesser role. I'm inclined to think it's a central distribution point. I'm just noting there's sort of lots of unknowns here.
No, I think there's people who are most people who are not on upstream nodes, that this is a deliberate effect, that the connectivity graph has been manipulated such that most people do not have an input node.
So more to talk about. I think it's going to be the case that the people will have input nodes, and that if you look at their intentions are to be dominated.
Yeah, but that's because they're getting their attention from somewhere else.
And then it's an interesting question who started it. Okay, that's all.